Accommodations in general allow candidates to have access to their exams. It's not a guarantee of an improved score or that you will pass the test. And sometimes people are a little confused about that because really under IDEA, the goal is success, right? Candidate success is the goal of IDEA. And so that's why sometimes in schools, candidates will be given reduced number of answer choices or testing over very long periods of time, those types of things. When candidates take the GED, that's governed by the ADA, and Americans with Disabilities Act is about access to physical locations and access to testing. Accommodations are considered on an individualized basis. And so, in other words, we don't say, okay, everybody with ADHD goes into this category and they will get this set of accommodations. We certainly embrace that candidates are individual people. Most candidates do not have a single disabling condition. They have some sort of comorbidity. So while they might present as ADHD, there may be some learning disability connected with that, or any number of combinations. So we would never say all people with this disability, this is how we're going to accommodate them. We take every single person as an individual, read all the documentation that they send in, and then determine a plan that will allow them to have access to the test. The last thing on this slide says appropriate documentation. I know that that can be difficult sometimes, particularly for candidates who have been out of school for a very long time. There does, however, need to be some documentation that is given with an accommodation request when it's sent in. And we'll talk about that more in a bit here. So this slide talks about the categories of disabilities, and you see we have 4 listed across here. We had a parent email us this week that was very angry because her son has a TBI and we don't have TBI listed as one of our categories. Well, these are very broad, general categories of disabling conditions. We would never say we can't review your request for accommodations because you applied under the wrong category. So please encourage your students and your teachers, others that you work with, to pick the category that fits closest and submit. And our team will review whatever is sent in. We would, again, never send it back and say, oh, you requested under learning, but really this is a psychological issue, so you should have used that category. We're happy to request under anything. And, things like a TBI are pretty interesting, traumatic brain injury. The result of a traumatic brain injury could result in learning and other cognitive disabilities, right? Or maybe it manifests in a person as a physical disorder and could be reviewed that way, could cause psychological, psychiatric conditions, could be reviewed that way. So you see, there would be lots of options, and whatever was submitted, we'd be happy to look at it. So the 4 broad categories that we use are learning and other cognitive disabilities. Generally, if someone has a learning disability, they would have some sort of a psychological or psychoeducational report that would likely have IQ and achievement scores, and then a diagnosis and recommendations for the accommodations that the person might need to be able to access the test. The documentation for learning disabilities is current if it's within the last 5 years. If it is a little older than 5, maybe 6, 6.5, send it in, let my team take a look at it. If it's 15 years old, yes, it is too old because we're looking for current functional limitations. So even with that, it might be helpful to send that old report and then maybe just get some sort of a new brief report from a psychologist to add with that to confirm that the disabilities the student had when this report was done are still there. And before I go on, let me just say that Beth and her team will be putting my PowerPoint slides on their site as a PDF. So I don't want you to feel like you need to madly be taking notes. You'll have access to my slides at the sometime after the presentation is over. So I forgot to say that at the beginning. I apologize. Okay, so let's move on then. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD or ADD. The documentation for that also should be within the last 5 years. Often the documentation for ADHD is a letter from a doctor who is qualified to diagnose ADHD. Very often ADHD is diagnosed when a student is young. However, there are students who fall through the cracks, right? And struggled all through school, but no one ever put 2 and 2 together and they didn't get their ADHD testing done and get a diagnosis until they're older. We review all of those, and whether it is a diagnosis from when the person was a child and then has a current letter, or whether it's newly diagnosed. We review all of those and grant accommodations when they are warranted. The third one here is psychological and psychiatric disorders. And you'll notice here it says the documentation within the last year. And the reason we do that is because these conditions can change quickly over time. And what's most important to us is that the candidates are safe when they are taking the GED test, and that the test center staff and other test takers are safe as well. So if someone has a psychological or psychiatric disorder, we want to have a current letter from a psychologist or a psychiatrist indicating what the condition is and how the candidate is doing right now. So that's why that is important to us. And then physical disorders and chronic health conditions. Again, we ask for that documentation to be from within the last year. Part of the reason is that those often can change over time. For example, a candidate might have an approval for someone to record the answers for them because they have a broken arm and they can't use the keyboard. That will heal. And so we would want a current letter from the doctor indicating that for the next 3 months, they're going to need this, but after that, they should be able to type on their own. The exception to the physical disorders and chronic health is someone who is blind or significantly visually impaired. Often those people don't have current documentation because if a person is blind, that almost without exception does not change over time, right? So that documentation does not have to be from within the last year. Okay. And just sometimes people say, well, is ESL something that I can have an accommodation for? English is not my first language. I see that you provide the test in English and Spanish. Well, what about me? I speak Farsi as my first language. Can I get extra time on my test? 2 reasons that isn't allowed. Number one, under the ADA, they do not consider ESL students as being disabled. So speaking English as a second language is not a disabling condition. And number 2, the GED is considered a high school equivalency, and the states are also involved here, and they say the test can only be presented in English or Spanish. The other one I'll call out here is test anxiety, and here's a place where one of these tips for you: a candidate with test anxiety is not eligible for an accommodation based strictly on the fact that they have a test anxiety. However, we reach back out to those students if they request under that category, and we tell them that while test anxiety is not a disabling condition, generalized anxiety is. And so we encourage them to go back to their healthcare provider and have a conversation with them about the possibility of getting a diagnosis of generalized anxiety. That is recognized under the ADA. That would mean a person that would have anxiety in multiple places. For example, does the student become anxious when they drive their car? Do they become anxious when they go to the grocery store? If the answer is yes to some of those other situations, their doctor may be able to provide them a document that says they have been diagnosed with generalized anxiety. And then we would be able to help them with accommodations on their test. So just a way of seeing how something that is requested can then, even though we have to say no to that, we can turn it into something that they possibly could get accommodations for. Beth, I might do one more slide and then I'll see if you have any questions for me. So we'll do one more here, commonly requested accommodations. So I've been with GED a very, very long time. Many years ago, I started as a GED teacher and then went to the state of Virginia as the state GED administrator. And I can say I've been here long enough that way back in the day, the request form for accommodations had a list of items that people could check for the accommodations they were requesting. Well, what people would do is often they would just check them all with the thought that, well, I'll just check them all and then GED can decide which ones I really need. We've turned that around and want it to be an interactive process with candidates. And that's why we don't have a list. Number one, the list, we couldn't possibly list all of the accommodations that candidates could receive because the list is always changing. We encourage people to request whatever accommodations they feel they need to access the test. And we want the candidate to have the opportunity, either on their own or working with their advocate, to tell us what accommodations they feel they need to be able to access the test. But this slide shows you the most commonly requested accommodations. Extra time. On the GED test, candidates can request 25%, 50%, or 100% extra time. If candidates don't, they just say they need extra time, we read through the documentation and see if we can determine what amount of extra time they need, or we reach out to the candidate and say, these are our options, what are you thinking? And we can then put a specific amount of time on the approval for them. Stop the clock breaks. Breaks are available 30 minutes of testing with a 5-minute break, or 45 minutes of testing with a 10-minute break. We recommend candidates use the 45 minutes of testing with a 10-minute break, just because 5 minutes isn't very long. And if a candidate needs a comfort break, needs to leave the testing room, get to the restroom, and then get back, that would likely take 10 minutes, especially if the bathroom is a fair ways away. While it sounds logical to do 30 minutes of testing and then I get a 5-minute break, it's the break time that you will want to talk with your student about. Do you think a 5-minute break is going to be long enough for you, or should we do the 10-minute breaks? I'm going to skip over to reader and or recorder. Just because I also want to talk about breaks in regard to a reader recorder. If a candidate is approved for a reader and or a recorder, we automatically give them 45 minutes of testing with a 10-minute break, not only for them so that they can rest their hearing, but for the person who's doing the reading, so that they have a little pause, a little rest in between doing 45 minutes of reading the test, and then they can get a little bit of a break as well. A reader recorder is a person that GED hires through our third party called U Exams, and that person is assigned to go to the test center and read the test for the candidate if they are approved for a reader, or record the answer. We also call it a scribe, but recorder or scribe, those words work interchangeably, or someone who reads the test and then puts the answers into the computer for the candidate. So the person can be hired to do one of those things or both of them together. Anytime there is a reader recorder, the candidate is always put in a separate room, which is the other most frequently requested accommodation here. Separate rooms are not only used when we have those assistive personnel doing the reading, but they can be used if a candidate has ADHD and they're just very, they just need the focus of being in a room by themselves, or they may have a condition that requires them to be separated from the rest of the group. For example, Tourette's, where a candidate has involuntary speech tics that would disturb other candidates. And so we put them in a room by themselves. They're able to test and they're not disturbing other candidates that are around them as they test. So Beth, I'm going to pause for a moment if you have any questions.
I don't have anything at this time, but let's give them let's take a little pause and give folks an opportunity to type into the chat. So if you have any questions at this point, go ahead and put those in the chat and we'll have Debbie respond to those. So anybody have a question? Let's give them just a minute. I don't have anything coming in. If something does come in during your next segment, I will grab it so that we can address it at the next pause.
Beautiful. Well, thanks everybody for your attention. I'm going to keep going then. So documentation guidelines. I talked before that candidates requesting accommodations do have to have documentation. And, this can be difficult for candidates who don't maybe have the means to get updated testing. I will tell you on our website, and I'll have those links for you at the end of my presentation. We do have, as a courtesy, a list of lower cost testing clinics. There are a few in each state. So there may be a lower cost testing clinic that you could recommend to your student. We also recommend that you work with agencies in your locale to try and create a relationship with them. I have heard of programs that work with places like the Shriners or the Lions or those kinds of service organizations. sometimes if you can get an in there and explain to them what we're doing, we're trying to help people get a GED exam so that they can go out and either get a job or get a better job so that they can get a family sustaining wage job to be able to help support their family. Those kinds of discussions go a long way with some of those service organizations, and maybe they would be able to help you with some funding for your students to be able to pay for their testing. Another thing I always recommend is look at the course of least resistance. And by that, I mean, if you have a candidate who is pretty sure they have a learning disability, but they don't have any documentation, that would likely require psychoeducational testing, which can, it can be really expensive. But if you work with your candidate and talk with them, perhaps they have another condition that might be able to get documentation easier and would be able to get them maybe the extra time that they need. I have an example of that. I had a student one time, I was working with her and her mom, and she was trying to get documentation of her learning disability. And, we tried several places to try and get her the documentation, and it just wasn't going well. And the mom and I were talking one evening on the phone, and the mom said something to me about her daughter only having one eye. And, I only see these, well, I don't even see them, but I only talk with them on the phone. I'm like, wait a minute, you said your daughter just has one eye? You've never told me that before. Well, she was so used to her daughter having one eye, that was just part of her life. But a person with one eye, if you cover one of your eyes, you'll see that your field of vision changes. And we were able to get her to go to the doctor, get a letter from her doctor talking about the fact that she just had one eye and how that impacted her field of vision, which then meant it took her longer to read things and extra time was appropriate. And we didn't need a psychoeducational report. We just needed that letter from the doctor saying because of her physical disability, she needed extra time. And there we went. And so with that extra time, she was able to take her exam and pass. And it was a wonderful, wonderful thing. So, all of that to say, sometimes it's not what it appears on the surface. And we encourage you to work with your students about other possibilities, or reach out to my team and say, this is the situation I'm in. Do you have any suggestions? We get those kinds of emails from people. So we encourage you to reach out to us as well, and we can try and help you figure out some way to help your students. So here is the link to the documentation guidelines. There are guidelines for all 4 of our large categories of accommodations. We encourage students to print out the documentation guidelines if they're going to the doctor and take them with them so that the doctor sees the kinds of information that we're looking for. It just makes it easier when the doctor is creating documentation to be able to have these guidelines. So encourage your student to go here and print out those guidelines. I've made a chart for you. This is accommodation request volume. The last couple of years have been really strange with COVID and shutdown and, classes not being in session and test centers being closed, all of those kinds of things. But I just thought you would find this chart interesting. So you'll see in 2019, you had 114 approved or partially approved accommodation requests. 89 were found incomplete, and we're going to talk about incompletes in just a moment. And you only had 2 requests that were denied. In 2020, in the heat of the pandemic, you had 89 approved or partially approved, 52 incomplete, and just 1 denied. And so far this year, you can see volume is going to be up this year, which is a great thing. 107 approved or partially approved, just 63 incomplete, and 3 denied. So that kind of gives you a little idea of what the volume of accommodation requests are from your fine state. So incomplete applications. The first reason requests are incomplete is no supporting documentation or supporting documentation that doesn't support the request. For example, someone requests accommodations, but what they submit is a letter from Social Security saying they get Social Security benefits. That might be helpful to submit in addition, but that doesn't tell us anything about what the disabling condition is, how it impacts the student's ability to take this exam. So that would be considered no supporting documentation, and we would write a letter back to them. Every one of those incomplete letters is hand-tailored to that particular candidate based on the information they provide. And we would give them recommendations of what they could provide for us to be able to make a determination for them. The next is missing pages. We get reports where it might be 10 pages and we get 13579, but whoever sent it to us didn't realize 246810 were on the back sides of those pages. So we have to find that incomplete. And again, in the letter, we would say, we've received 13579, but please send us 246810. And then when we get that, we would review the whole report, and then we would be able to make a determination. And then outdated documentation. And we've talked about that already, but let me just say that again. Even if the documentation appears to be old, if it's a couple of years old, send it in and let my team take a look. If it's 10 years old, yeah, it is too old, but then employ that course of least resistance idea and see if you can work with your student to get documentation on a condition that would be a little less arduous for them to get the documentation, and that might be able to work for your candidate. So our accommodation system features, our request system, oh gosh, it's been at least 3 years ago now. We changed from everyone having to fax in paper request forms, which I will tell you, it was the best thing we had at the time, but it was really frustrating for candidates because they would fax their information in and then they would wait. And then they would wait. And then many days later, when they didn't hear back from us, they would message us or call us and say, I haven't heard anything yet. And we would look, and it was because we hadn't received anything. So, you know, faxing, while it had its place and it was pretty good technology at the time, it just wasn't the most efficient because you didn't get any immediate feedback as to the fact that your fax had gone through the system. And so with the online request system, the coolest thing is that once the candidate completes the application process, there are 6 steps, but 2 of the steps don't really even need any attention. So in reality, it's 4 steps. Once they do those 4 steps and create their application, they click the submit button and they get immediate feedback from our system saying, we've received your request, it's in review, you will hear back from us within 30 calendar days. Don't let the 30 days scare you. Most often our reviews take less than that. We are, we say we will get them done within 30 days, but most often they're done in less than 30 days. So the candidate will get that. that says, we've received your request. And I think that's really helpful for them. To request accommodations, candidates just need to go to their GED.com account, and in their profile, they need to click yes to the question about accommodations. Do you need accommodations on the test? If they've created their account and they either didn't know or they didn't think they needed accommodations and they checked no, don't worry, they can go in and they can just simply edit their profile and change that question from no to yes and save. And then the link that they need will appear as a file icon at the top of their page, and they'll be able to click on that and start the process for applying for accommodations. So it's a really simple process. If candidates try that and they have problems with it, I'll show you our email address when we get to the end here. They certainly can email us, and all they have to say is, I'm not getting this, I'm struggling, I'm not able to use the process, can you help me? And my team will either write back to them and give them some help applying, or call them if they need a phone call and talk them through it. Or if it just absolutely isn't going to work that way, we'd also still have the paper request forms. We have them hidden because we really want people to use this online system if possible, so they get that automatic ping when they submit and all of their information is the way they want it in the system. But we do have still paper request forms. They are hidden on the corrections page of the GED website. I'll again show you that link when we get toward the end, but those forms are there and candidates certainly can use those and fax those to us, and we can upload those for the candidate and they can get into the system that way as well. So as far as I know, we will always have the paper forms as a backup if people need them. The other systems feature I just want to talk about for a second is web scheduling. There was a time when if candidates had accommodations, they all had to call in to schedule their exam. GED has done enhancements, and now anybody who has an accommodation that doesn't require us to reach out to a test center, those can be scheduled on the web. So for example, extra time, breaks, those kinds of things. The candidate's letter will tell them you can go to GED.com and schedule your test. If the candidate is approved for something that does require manual intervention, for example, they need a reader and or a recorder, they need a separate room, those kinds of accommodations do require our scheduling team to work with the test center to determine a locality that can offer those. And so those kinds of requests, the candidate's letter would say, please call the 800 number for assistance with scheduling your exam. But otherwise, they are able to schedule them online, which is a wonderful enhancement. Assistive technology. We have several things available for the GED test. One is called Universal Access Features. These are things like enlarged font, up to an 18-point font, a highlighting tool, and interchangeable colors. So, for example, using a yellow background with maybe blue writing. All of those features are available to all candidates, and they do not require an accommodation approval. There is a drop down on the menu of the test that they can click on if they want to use one of those features. So sometimes someone just wants the font just bumped up a little bit, maybe to a 14-point font. They can do that, does not require an accommodation approval. It's available to all candidates. It's called Always On. If the candidate needs magnification stronger than that, maybe they need 24-point font, then they would use something called Zoom text. And Zoom text does require an accommodation request and approval. And with Zoom text software, the candidate can blow the test up as large as they need it to be able to see the test. JAWS is another software that is available. JAWS stands for Job Access with Speech. Job Access with Speech is JAWS. It reads the test to the candidates. With both Zoom text and JAWS, things to remember are candidates need to request those accommodations, and candidates need to be proficient. Zoom text isn't as difficult to learn, but JAWS, you absolutely must be JAWS proficient. If you can imagine, the first thing that you do with JAWS is there is no mouse or cursor for you. So this is really for candidates who are blind or significantly vision impaired, and that little mouse, or the mouse and the little cursor bouncing around the screen, doesn't mean anything to them because they can't see it. Well, as sighted individuals, that's how we take our cue of where things are on the screen, right? We look at where the cursor is, and then we can move it up or down with our mouse. Candidates that are blind can't do that. So they need to be using that on a daily basis. Candidate will use what we call keyboard shortcuts to navigate around the screen in lieu of using their cursor and their mouse. We also have adaptive equipment available for candidates. We have, and it's sort of like, I would call it a lending library. So if a candidate has documentation that supports them using maybe a trackball mouse or an ergonomic keyboard, any number of those kinds of equipment things, we have closets full of that kind of equipment. We ship it directly to the test center. The test center has it ready when the candidate comes in to test that day. They sit down at their workstation. The ergonomic keyboard is already there for them, hooked up, and away they go. When the test is over, the test center puts it back in the box and ships it back to us so it's ready for the candidate. I do want to talk, I think this is a good time to talk about candidates that are blind. We have multiple things that those candidates can use to access the test. We've talked about JAWS, that's the speech reading software. We also have a Braille version of the test. If they do have some vision, they could use Zoom text and just blow the words up to a point where they can read them. Or we can provide a reader and or a recorder for the candidate who would read the test material to the test taker and then enter the answers to them into the computer. So some emerging trends, accommodations versus fundamental alteration. We do have candidates that request things like reduced answer choices. Again, those are not things that can be done on the GED test. Accommodations versus security. It's an interesting world we live in. Not probably 2 years ago, I would have said to you, we will never, ever allow a cell phone in a GED test. Well, you know, be careful what you say, because there are times when we may need to approve a cell phone for a candidate who has some sort of a glucose monitoring situation, and they need to have their cell phone available for them to alert them of their blood sugar readings. We have to be very careful because security is an issue. And so the candidates put their phone in airplane mode and they're not allowed to touch it. It's near them, but they're not allowed to touch it while they're testing. If they do need to touch it, they raise their hand and the TA comes in and observes. But we have to be very careful that people aren't taking photos, of course, or recording testing material. So, you know, in the world we live in today, there are times when we have to work on a creative solution for candidates to be able to access the exam. And then non-standard exams, or excuse me, non-standard requests. We do have requests from candidates for lights off in the testing room. For example, it is difficult to find a test center that can approve lights off. A lot of times it is just a safety issue. The lights are on, and if we turned them off, it would turn all of the lights off. So we work with that candidate to either find a testing center that maybe has a separate room where the lights are for the separate room are on a separate switch, and we could turn them off in that separate room. They can bring in a desk lamp if they need that sort of a light in there. But the other thing we do is reach back out to the candidate and offer a slightly different accommodation. For example, instead of lights off in the testing room, could we possibly offer the candidate to wear a visor or a hat and sunglasses? So depending on what their disabling condition is, sometimes just being able to wear sunglasses and have that visor on will take care of the situation. And then they're able to test at the location that's closest to them. If not, then we have to work with them to try and find a location that can turn the lights off. The accommodation review process, I have a team of 11 people. They have a variety of backgrounds, and we work together as a team to review files and make determinations. And we look at all the documentation. Sometimes candidates send in a 98-page report, and we do have to read through every page because it might be page 57 that has the information that we need to be able to approve accommodations for this candidate. We provide written explanations to candidates if their request is found incomplete or denied. If a candidate's request is denied, we have an appeal process where the candidate can appeal that decision. Appeals are sent to external reviewers who are not part of the GED testing service, and they do an independent review of the request that was sent in, and then they offer their suggestions. So how can you help your students? There is a comfort aid list, and in a slide or two, you'll get all of those links. But the comfort aid list are things that candidates can bring to the testing center that do not require approval. So for example, if you have a student that's ready to take the test, and all of a sudden they come to school one day and, oh my goodness, they're on crutches and their foot is all wrapped up. And they tell you, I need to prop up my foot on a stool. How am I ever going to be able to take the test? Well, that stool is on our comfort aid list, and candidates can bring that with them, does not require an approval. They can bring that with them to the test to be able to prop up their leg. Their crutches as well are on the comfort aid list. So become familiar with the items that are on the comfort aid list. You might be able to answer some of your candidates' questions about what they may or may not bring into the testing room by just looking at that list. Everything that's on that list is subject to visual inspection. So that means that we would ask the candidate to just hold it up, and the test staff would just kind of take a look at it. They wouldn't touch it. And then the candidate can take it into the testing room with them. I've talked about the lower cost testing clinics. Assisting with paperwork. Candidates do not have to do this on their own. And please be assured, we consider ourselves advocates for your students as well as you. So, I'd like us all to think about what we can do to advocate for these students to help them either be able to schedule their test or be able to apply for accommodations. We can all be there for them. Encourage your students to start the process early. Accommodation approvals are valid for a whole year. So if classes are starting now this fall and someone discloses that they have a disability or you somehow find that out, please encourage them to start, even if you think they might not be able to test or ready to test until springtime. Start now. The request review can take up to 30 days, but if we even just get it done in 20 days, but we find that it's incomplete because we're looking for an updated letter from a doctor, that gives the student plenty of time to make the appointment, get to the doctor, get the updated documentation, get it sent to us so that when they are ready to test, that's already in place. It's the one thing they don't need to worry about is, am I going to get my extra time on the test? Absolutely. If you have an accommodation approval, that's valid for a year. If they end up taking more time than they had hoped or that you think to be able to be ready for the test, there is a way that they can just ask for an extension and we can extend it for another year. So please encourage them to start early and help them as you can. Just a note here on some outer limits. We do get requests for unlimited time. That sort of comes from school, right? There are people on their students on their IEP that are given unlimited time to take their tests. On the GED test, the most time that can be requested is double time. This waiving a portion of the test, we get those requests more often than one would think, particularly the math portion. We have people that write to us frequently and say, I've passed all the modules but math. I just can't pass the math. And then they give us some reasons why we should waive the math portion of the test for them. All candidates must take and pass all 4 modules of the test. I always take the approach when those come to me that I assure the candidate that they will feel so good about themselves when they're able to pass that last section of the test. And so then I try to give them some encouragement and some suggestions of things that they can do to prepare themselves to take that test over again. Another thing, we in the test centers cannot administer medical care. However, medical care can be requested. A candidate can request to have a personal care attendant either in the waiting room or if their needs are significant enough to be in the testing room with them. It does require accommodation approval, letters from a doctor saying that this is the need. But we do from time to time get candidates that are what I would say medically brittle, and they need to have someone in the room assisting them with their personal medical needs. So they can bring a person with them to do that. So if someone asked about somebody to administer medical help, we would say GED can't do that, but we can work with you to approve for you to bring someone with you to be able to provide those cares for you when you're testing. Okay, so here are some information about a page on GED.com. These are some of the items that you will want to go to GED.com and the accommodation page and click on these links. One is frequently asked questions. See, the next one is the lower cost testing clinics. You'll want to click on that link, see what Texas has there. Personal items and minor modifications, those are the things on the comfort aid list that I talked about a minute ago. And then if you or candidates have general accommodation questions, please go to accommodations@ged.com. That's a shared box that my team works out of. So you get really quick answers Generally same day. If it's later in the day, you might get your response in the morning, but you will get a quick response for questions on accommodations at accommodations@ged.com. You'll get this page as well. This shows you where the GED accommodation page is. And you'll see the second one, the paper request forms. That's the link for the corrections page on the GED website. When you go there, scroll all the way to the very bottom and you'll see the paper request forms are hidden there. And then one more time, the accommodations@ged.com. Any accommodation questions can be sent there. You can ask questions there. You can give that email address to candidates or advocates. Everybody can have that link. And then Beth, I'll take any questions that might be there and I'll leave up this page. I am giving you my personal email address. So generally questions would go to accommodations@ged.com. But if you have a question about the presentation today or something that you really want to just reach out to me personally about, email me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Debbie.berktholt@pearson.com. Please don't share that with everyone. I'm just one person, but I would be happy and honored to hear from you if you have a question you'd like to ask me. And Beth, I'll stop there. Any questions?
Karen, this is when you were talking about the accommodations being good for 1 year.
Yes.
Karen asked, is the year that the approval is valid a year from the approval date?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then Tricia asked, I missed the discussion about low-cost testing clinics. Can you briefly explain what these are?
Yes, so they're mostly universities who have psychology students who can do assessments. They are often they're part of maybe a psychology student's coursework. They're done under the supervision of a licensed psychologist. And because the student is doing it as practice, they're either free or low cost. It's kind of a two-fold thing. It allows that psych student to get practice, and then it allows our students at a lower cost assessment. If there isn't anything on the list I've provided, if you have universities in your local area, check with them. If they have a psychology department, they may have students who might be able to help you.
Sylvia asked, how would a person complete an accommodation not on the drop-down menu?
Yes, and those are those paper request forms. Something that's, sorry, that's not on there. There is other as a category. So they can click on other and free form fill in the request they're wanting to make. Good question.
And then this last one is not necessarily about accommodation. So you may or may not know the answer to this. Jonna may. From Cheryl, I have a lot of military and military families. Does GED allow for GI Bill funding? Yeah,
Jonna, are you still on? Do you know the answer to that?
I am still on, and I don't know if GI funding provides for GED. That is the way it would go, that would be a policy decision for GI funding. So let me take a look at that, because that's a Dante's kind of question. I know that GED testing is available on a lot of the bases and posts in Texas, as well as local colleges, et cetera. So let me take a look at that real quick. That's a unique question for sure.
All right. Thank you, Cheryl. Well, thank you, Debbie and Jonna. This was great information. We certainly appreciate you taking time out of your afternoon to work with our staff here in Texas. And we hope everyone has a great afternoon.